Hello, and welcome to a bonus box of Warhammer 40k's Grim History from Beyond. I'm Zeckthar, and for the next couple of weeks we'll be talking about the Sabbat Crusades. Yes, those wars that are so well known thanks to Scribe Dan Abnett's chronicling of the 10th First Sinoli, also known as Gaunt's Ghosts. I figured that while we will talk about them, it would be interesting to get a more global aspect of what happened. And it all starts in the Sabbat system. Now, situated along the rimward portion of the Segmentum Pacificus, the region now known as the Sabbat World Sector was first annexed for Imperial colonization in the 35th millennium. This often volatile region of space is composed of over 100 human-inhabited star systems, subdivided into a number of discrete territories or subsectors, most notably the Newfound trailing, the Con group, the Cabal system, the Carcharodon cluster, and the Ruinous group. First annexed for Imperial colonization in the 35th millennium, the name Sabbat refers to the area's original redeemer, Saint Sabbat, a young girl who received a vision from the Emperor of Mankind to bring the region into the Imperium during an Imperial Crusade that lasted for 105 standard years and began in 500.M35. By the 37th millennium, mankind was well established throughout the region, with an estimated population of roughly 5 trillion and a thriving local, interstellar economic infrastructure. However, due to its exposure to the eternal threats of the outer dark along the galactic rim, control of the Sabbat worlds was ever disputed with the forces of chaos and various Xenos species. Throughout the 38th millennium, the region suffered a series of brutal wars and conflicts with the barbaric chaos-worshipping human tribes of so-called sanguinary worlds, located further rimwards of the spineward extent of the Sabbat worlds, and the area soon became known as a troublesome province to the administratum. However, during the first centuries of the 31st millennium, the situation altered drastically. A charismatic, brutal chaos warlord known as Archon rallied the tribes of sanguinary worlds to war, and a series of assaults began from galactic trailward into the region. The assault was thought at first to be a return to the minor chaos conflicts of the 30th millennium in the region, but in the standard years following 600.M41, it became impossible to ignore the true threat presented by Chaos Undivided. The ruinous powers had decided to take the whole region away from the Imperium, and their chosen forces launched a series of devastating attacks into the sector, conquering and destroying everything in their path. The ultimate goal of the forces of chaos in the sector was to drive out the Imperium and re-establish their mastery over the worlds they had been driven from by Saint Sabbat and her original Imperial Crusade of the 35th millennium. These Sabbat incursions were just one of a half-dozen major chaos invasions suffered by the Imperial star systems of the Segmentum Pacificus during this period. The Imperial defense of the Sabbat worlds proved valiant, but ultimately unequal to the task, though it should be noted that the Imperium was simultaneously fighting 8 other significant campaigns throughout Imperial-controlled space during this period. To consolidate their lines of defense, the Segmentum Pacificus High Command had to make bitter decisions, sacrificing certain portions of Imperial space in order to enhance the Imperium's best chance to resist the Chaos onslaught. Severely underestimating the Archon's forces, the Segmentum High Command tried to do what they thought best for the Sabbat worlds. But ultimately, the meager Imperial defense was not enough, and the sector was conquered wholesale by the servants of the ruinous powers, returning the Sabbat worlds to their heretical roots. The Sabbat worlds were swiftly reconquered and occupied by Archon's forces, although many Imperial worlds in the region continued to resist in isolated outposts of the Emperor's Light in a vast sea of apostasy and heresy. Some managed to hold out for solar decades, whilst others managed to do so for more than a Terran century. Unfortunately, by 740.M41, the Sabbat worlds could no longer be considered to be under Imperial governance, as this troublesome province was reclassified by the Administratum as an unstable or hazard region of space. In 741.M41, the Sabbatus Imperialis was officially suspended in the region by the Administratum, and the sector's Lord Governor was moved to a neighboring sector for his own safety. The Sabbat worlds were from this point forward regarded as entirely lost to the Imperium, having become dominions of chaos. Following the disastrous loss of the Sabbat worlds in 741.M41, there were many suggestions to send a military expedition to liberate the besieged sector. This idea was especially championed by the exiled sector governor, but those within the high echelon of the Imperial military had little or no enthusiasm for such an investiture of time, expense, and materials. All except one man, Lord Militant Slaydo. This very capable Imperial commander was already noted and experienced, owing his fame to a string of several stunning victories he had won during the successful Caminen Wars, which took place between 752 and 754.M41. Now, before we continue, we must give a little background as to why Slaydo would wish to start this massive campaign against Chaos. After all, he is truly the only person who thought that this was important at the time. One might also ask why nobody else was behind this crusade, and the answer is fairly simple: attrition. Like I mentioned before, the Empire was beset with 8 other invasions, and while the Sabbat system was already lost, they could save the others. Like I mentioned when I did my bonus Vox on the Badab War, and before you ask, no, that was not one of the conflicts going on while this took place. The High Lords are reactive, not proactive. Some of this is honestly because the Empire is so big, they must pick and choose where to muster their forces. And the other reason is more insidious: greed. The system was already lost. To reconquer it would take more lives, more money to retake than to hold on to the other places. But why Slaydo wanted to lead the crusade was actually fairly simple. He was a pious man of faith. Warmaster Slaydo, in fact, held a particular affection for the legacy of Saint Sabbat, who was his personal patron saint. Slaydo had long felt it a personal duty to conduct the liberation of the Sabbat worlds from the forces of chaos. Over 2 decades before the crusade had even commenced, many of his senior commanders and aides related stories of Slaydo's passion for the cause of the saint. It was later noted that even in the initial planning stages of the crusade, Slaydo believed that he was walking in the path of the saint, an oft-overlooked reference to Saint Sabbat's original campaign to bring the Sabbat worlds into the Imperium of Man during the 35th millennium, and her great advisor, Fornax, whom Slaydo especially admired. The Warmaster believed in paying great respect to the wisdom and beliefs of the figures that had inspired him to undertake the crusade in the first place. Now, don't let this fool you into thinking Slaydo is a passive man. He was a tactical genius, and capitalized on his popularity within the rank and file of the Astra Militarum, and petitioned the High Lords of Terra for the honor of leading the Imperial Crusade to liberate the Sabbat worlds. As a Lord Militant, Slaydo actively sought to lead the crusade, petitioning the High Lords directly during the Kulan campaign. He had supported the actions as early as 732.M41, as he felt a strong passion for the liberation of the hard-won territories that had been so poorly discarded. Many of his senior commanders and aides related that Slaydo believed this to be an imperial crime. In 755.M41, the High Lords finally declared him War Master and charged him with the sacred duty of carrying out this monumental undertaking. Slaydo's subsequent elevation to this esteemed position was the envy of his fellow Lords Militant, which were quickly tempered by the realization of the task that had been set before Slaydo. Now, we have used the term War Master before, and when we have spoken about it, it has not been a good term. The 2 War Masters we have mentioned were that of Horus Lupercal and Abaddon the Despoiler, and as you can see from the names, you would think that the War Master is not a name of well repute within the Imperium. Yet War Master has been used several times since the Great Crusade, and at present, the title of War Master is one of the most powerful ranks that can be granted to an officer of the Imperial Armed Forces, including officers of the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Navy, or a chapter master of one of the Adeptus Astartes, who is commanding a much larger Imperial force. The rank is officially second in the Imperial military hierarchy, only to that of Lord Commander Militant of the Astra Militarum, who serves on the Senatorium Imperialis as one of the High Lords of Terra, and is the Commander-in-Chief of the Astra Militarum. The title of War Master is bestowed by the High Lords of Terra in the 41st millennium, when an Imperial crusade is being planned, and resources from multiple Imperial sectors are needed. The overall command designated by the rank of War Master is necessary as inter- and intra-service strife and bureaucratic rivalries might make assembling the material required and cooperating in the field difficult for officers for the difficult services without a clear grant of supreme authority. The rank is not available unless granted by the High Lords of Terra, and it is the normal formulation to say that such an individual has been given his or her command by the Emperor himself.
There is rarely more than one Warmaster operating within the Imperium at any one time, due to the extreme powers given to the holder of the title. Some in the Imperium consider the title of Warmaster to be cursed, or a sign of ill omen because of the ties of the rank to Horus and the Horus heresies. This is one reason why the title is rarely granted, and also the reason the rank is officially proclaimed as Lord Commander Solar, rather than Warmaster, when bestowed by the Senatorium Imperialis, though the whole of the title is usually addressed as Warmaster by his subordinates. Now, getting back to Slaydo, the Warmaster's only overriding fear was that his advanced age, being of the ripe old age of 150 standard years, he would not live to see the eventual victorious completion of such a massive campaign. Warmaster Slaydo and his senior staff commanders spent nearly the entire standard year planning at Kulan for the opening phase of advance into the Sabbat worlds. The vast Imperial Armada began to assemble at the stage at Kulan, Kulan Outreach, San Sargo, Kazan II, Arvix Cardinal, and the Bethane Halo. The Warmaster compiled an impressive Imperial force, comprised of almost 1 billion Imperial Guardsmen of the Astra Militarum, along with massive retinues of armor and artillery, 6 chapters of Adeptus Astartes, and Titan legions from the Collegia Titanica, provided by the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Warmaster studied and rejected over 30 attack plans until he found a scheme that would favor the Imperial military strength the most. All options were weighed and considered until the final scheme was decided upon. Codenamed Red Drake, Warmaster Slaydo sent the signal to advance on the 266th day of 755.M41. Slaydo believed that in order to launch a successful Imperial crusade into the Sabbat worlds, his massive mobilization of Imperial forces would have to take the fight to several fronts from the outset of hostilities in order for the crusade to prosper. The best solution for initial advancement required a mobile fleet to accomplish fourfold objectives. First, to secure a foothold in the Sabbat worlds that could be developed. Second, to catch the arch-enemy unaware. Thirdly, to defuse any enemy response away from the concentrated counterattack on his fleet. And fourthly, to provide a quick and, in his words, showy victory to maintain allied morale. Already his enemies had shown signs of preparation on their part. Operation Red Drake, named for the Red Drake snake, a multi-headed predator that could attack several targets at once with deadly effect, would involve simultaneous invasions of the Newfound trailing group, Onskard, and Long Halant, and a 4th Imperial Fleet Division striking all the way to the core of the system of Indrid. These multiple assaults, the Warmaster hoped, would partition the Chaos forces and confuse the response and any immediate attempt on their part to develop and implement a counter-strategy. Slaydo selected Lords Militant Hummel and Delaney to lead the attack on Onskard, Generals Draver and Akensor for Long Halant, Lord Militant Cybon for Indrid, and Slaydo himself would lead the assault on Formal Prime. Despite the massive size of his Imperial Expeditionary Fleet, the attacks were conducted as lightning strikes, as they engaged directly from retranslation from warp space. Long Halant fell immediately, due to the modest numbers of hostile forces, which the Imperials easily overwhelmed. Less than 3 solar weeks later, Onskard was also taken. There were some bitter pockets of resistance in the outlying cities, but these were extinguished by the start of 756.M41. The assault on Formal Prime, however, proved to be the first substantial opposition for the new Warmaster and provided the Imperial forces their first taste of how bloody the crusade would become. The complexity of the terrain and the fanaticism of the opposition would prove to be a hindrance in the Warmaster's stated objective of securing the planet within 6 solar weeks. The initial assault went well, but then progress began to flounder, as the zealous followers of Chaos made the Imperials pay dearly for their overconfidence, as the attrition rate for the Imperial Guardsmen climbed to untenable levels. Nearly 200 soldiers died for every meter of ground taken. With casualties mounting and the assault grinding down into the 11th week, Slaydo knew his reputation was at stake, as was the overall morale of the crusade. The impasse was finally broken by the deployment of a force of White Scar's Space Marines, whose highly mobile assault tactics purged the hive worlds of the remaining heretics. Lord Militant Cybon also faced staunch opposition as rapid reinforcements were brought in from Melsar and Telescent. Fighting a war on 2 fronts, Cybon executed a brilliant feint withdrawal that drew in the forces of the arch-enemy onto his ranged batteries on Colchis, utilizing orbital bombardment at the expense of ground troops. But despite these setbacks, Operation Red Drake has succeeded in achieving its goals. Now the way was over to the next phase of the crusade. Slaydo dubbed these follow-up assaults as Operation Newfound. The opposition of the forces of chaos within the Sabbat worlds had, so far, proven to be more difficult and intense than the high echelon of commanders of the crusade had originally envisioned. Tactical records show that the Warmaster revised his estimated liberation date for Balhaut at least 37 times as the crusade bogged down due to fierce organized resistance, throwing off the Warmaster's calculated schedule time and again. These difficulties were compounded by three factors. Firstly, the bodies of the enemy population dug into various world sites, armored against attack and prepared for resistance. These populations sometimes numbered in the millions, and were often under the leadership of a sacred and charismatic leader, sometimes with the rank of Magister. Secondly, there were the counter-assault forces sent by the Archon to meet the Imperial push, in the form of raider fleets and military convoys. These raider fleets were highly mobile and able to concentrate their attack on the Imperial forward echelon. Within the last 2 solar months of 756.M41 alone, 8 significant fleet engagements occurred. Thirdly, there were smaller Chaos raiding forces, referred to as mobile opportunists, that plagued crusade deployments by running raids and guerrilla assaults on supply lines and rally depots. The second phase of the crusade, known as Operation Newfound, focuses priorities on the liberation of the Newfound trailing group. Just before the initial phase of Newfound took place, the crusade focused on liberating the towering hive cities of Ashek II. The prosecution of Ashek II began in 756.M41, but the scale of fighting increased in 757.M41. Their task of liberating the planet was made extremely difficult by the fact that they faced the notorious and brilliant Heritor Asphodel, who was the most tactically gifted Magister serving the Archon. Asphodel showed a predilection for deploying grotesque demonic war engines that were dubbed woe machines. Some speculate that somewhere in the Magister's past, he may have some connection to the Forge world, or even to the cult Mechanicus itself. The Imperial commanders soon became painfully aware of the futility of sending Imperial waves of infantry troops against Asphodel's woe machines. Petitioned for heavier support, Slaydo responded by providing 3 brigades of armor from the Marchen, 45th, and 2nd Narmenian heavy regiments. Significant gains were only made later when nearly a full-strength squadron of battle titans of the Collegia Titanica arrived to support the Imperial assault. This was the first significant deployment of the Adeptus Mechanicus war engines in the Crusade, led by the ancient Imperial-class titan Imperius Corpalius. The mighty war machine's subsequent engagement lasted for 3 solar months. In the end, Asphodel's woe machines were destroyed, and the defeated Magister fled Ashek II. Initially, Ambold 11 had been an opening phase target of the Crusade, but at the final hour had been rejected by Warmaster Slaydo. Ambold 11 became instead a target for the second phase, Operation Newfound, and the assault began in the middle of 756.M41. A swift and brutal fleet action commanded by Admiral Carsley commenced, and the Imperial forces successfully decimated the orbital forts above the planet and destroyed enemy shipping at both high and low anchor. This allowed for Imperial troop forces under the command of General Dylan Belfry to execute an overnight drop into strategic enemy strongholds. The forces of the arch-enemy were well entrenched, driving back the Imperial guardsmen during successive actions. Approximately 9,500 guardsmen were killed trying to breach the sturdy concentric walls defending these citadels. General Belfry himself was killed in a mortar attack. His subordinate, Colonel Begulin, of the Sarpoi regiments, attempted to consolidate the losses, but foolishly managed to trap the main portion of the Imperial ground forces between a deadly crossfire. Space Marines of the Iron Snakes, en route to Sverin, answered the frantic signals, voluntarily diverting and made a drop pod assault on the targeted cities to relieve the desperate and beleaguered Imperial Guard forces. The proud warriors of Ithaca put 2 highs to the sword, as 29,000 of the archenemy troops were slaughtered, and only the loss of 81 Iron Snakes. A solar week later, the last targeted hive fell, as the Iron Snakes stormed the walls and executed the archenemy leaders by crucifixion. Unfortunately, instead of learning from his mistakes, Colonel Begelen was subsequently executed by the Commissariat for gross leadership errors. The next assault took place on Zveran. Zveran was a key world strategically central to the region known as the Holy Visage, and was in the remit of Operation Newfound. Once again, the brutal campaign to liberate this world was mired by circumstance and the tenacity of the arch-enemy's forces. Commanded by Lord Militant Hummel and General Bulletin, an Astra Militarum army invaded 757.M41, routing the gathering of Chaos troops and killing Magister Cuvello in the initial assault. But circumstances quickly changed when the weather turned bad, and the Imperial ground forces were forced to dig in, bogging down the assault. The forces of the archenemy were able to regroup and attempted to repulse the Imperial forces. General Bulletin braved the inclement weather, pushing his battalions towards the city of Ramri. Encircling the city, it soon fell after a short siege. Lord Militant Hummel, on the other hand, focused his efforts on the city of Colchis, and after a 6-week aerial campaign, eventually won air superiority on Zveran. Nefer City proved to be much more difficult to subdue, as Bulletin lost 3,000 soldiers for the gain of only 2 miles of land. Offering his resignation to Warmaster Slaydo for his failure, it was refused. Slaydo sent back a dispatch which read, "Do it again." Bulletin took his orders from the Warmaster to heart, and finally, on the 241st day of 758.M41, Bulletin's forces and a single warlord-class titan, the Victrix Impassionata, overran the walls of Nefer City. Storming the upper palace, the Magister's second-in-command, Peter Booker, was killed while resisting capture. The campaign on the hive world of Fornax Aleph proved to be troublesome from the very beginning, highlighting the difficulties faced by the Imperial forces when encountering a world that had been affected by chaos in the most unnerving and inexplicable ways. Fornax Aleph had been established by long-range fleet reconnaissance to be a powerful bastion of the forces of chaos in 757.M41. Heavy fighting was expected as Fornax Aleph appeared to contain formidable hive cities and a possible fleet reserve. Under the command of General Jader Elbeth, a large ground force composed of 7 Astra Militarum regiments of infantry troops and 2 armored brigades prepared for the assault on the enemy stronghold. Their forces would be further reinforced by elements of the Iron Snakes chapter. The initial assault was delayed twice due to unusual potent warp storms, the second of which forced the Iron Snakes into a 4 solar month holding pattern. General Elbeth's invasion fleet also suffered from the warp storms, which scattered his invasion fleet as they arrived at Fornax Aleph. Unfortunately for Elbeth, only 1/3 of his fleet arrived unmolested, and of promised Astartes support, there was no sign. The general cautiously moved his fleet to an out-system translation point to hold until their reinforcements arrived, or, in the event of attack, translate into warp space at the first sign of trouble. Yet, still not wanting to lose the advantage of perhaps easy prey, on the 303rd day of 757.M41, Elbeth ordered one of his frigates to pass by the planet and assess the strengths and disposition of the enemy forces. The frigate reported, to the astonishment of Elbeth's tactical staff, that they had encountered no resistance because the world's orbital fleet yards were entirely empty of activity. Furthermore, they detected no activity on the planet's surface. No electromagnetic activity, no power or industry, no motion whatsoever. According to orbital aspect scans, the great hive city of Fornax Aleph was totally empty and dead. The following day, the general took advantage of the situation and landed a spearhead force in advance of the reinforcements. There was no resistance, as Elbeth's forces soon discovered that the world was entirely bereft of life. Plague was initially suspected, or some other unknown mortality, but there were no signs of either bodies or burial pits. Appraising Warmaster Slaydo of the situation, Elbeth sent extensive reports on the strange occurrence. Fornax Aleph was, for all intents and purposes, a vacant world. Its population had simply disappeared, without a trace and without explanation. The reports continued back and forth between the general and the Warmaster, until on the first day of 758.M41, when the transmissions from Elbeth's Liberation Force ceased. Arriving 80 solar days later, due to severe warp delays, the Iron Snakes reported to the Warmaster that there was no Imperial forces on Fornax Aleph at all. The Iron Snakes scoured the planet for any sign of the general and his troops, and their battle barges searched the nearby N system. Whatever inexplicable fate had befallen, the people of Fornax Aleph had now overtaken Albiath and his liberation force as well. The Warmaster signaled to the Astartes to withdraw their forces before a similar fate befell them too. But on the 130th day of 757.M41, circumstances changed dramatically. A previously undetected comet or meteor struck the planet in the polar region, causing great natural disasters. The Iron Snakes hunkered down and rode out the devastation, but the impact brought with it dire portents. Hordes of demons came forth, pouring out of the devastated northern ice shelf and congregating around the hive cities. The world of Fornax Aleph was infested by these creatures of chaos. Led by brother Captain Cools, the Iron Snakes assault force, 300 battle brothers strong, were besieged by the uncounted multitudes of infernal creatures. In the first month of 759.M41, delayed portions of General Alba's assault force finally arrived in system and immediately deployed in support of the Astartes on the planet's surface. But the valiant Iron Snakes had already destroyed the demonic army, emerging victorious. A viable explanation for the disappearance of Fornax Aleph's population has never been made, though some suggest that there may have been a connection with the warp storm activity in system at the time. The Imperium eventually recolonized the vacant planet, repopulating its massive empty hives. There have been no further reports of strange disappearances or other significant activity, though there are still reports of unexplained screams of anguish in the dead of night. Caminen was one of the most problematic worlds encountered during the Newfound trailing. Dubbed as the world that refused to die, Caminen collectively cost more Imperial lives in the fighting on the notorious fortress world of Morlont. It had been estimated that over 8 million Imperial guardsmen perished fighting for the liberation of the damned planet. At the beginning of the campaign, the Imperial forces made an auspicious start. A series of assaults were made under the command of General Kelso and General Fogus. Yet at the beginning of the campaign, Lord Militant Vecrus was sent to depose General Forgas, whose behavior had become increasingly erratic. It was later rumored that he was actually replaced following a heated argument with the Warmaster. Later that year, Vecrus and 47 men in his retinue were killed in an enemy armor ambush due to faulty intelligence, and what came to be referred to as the Saber Bridge Incident. Famous for his trust in armor, Kelso directed the main thrust of the assault, winning 3 hive cities, Harshan, Beloquin, and Nezeth, in a 6-month period. Employing armored forces against the arch-enemy, 2 significant tank battles took place, eventually winning the outer hab of Harshan. Despite these Imperial triumphs, the war on Caminen ground down to a tediously slow pace. The world was finally taken in 762.M41, after an extensive and punishing ground war. But the world's future was troubled, one as fleeing forces of the arch-enemy retook the planet twice. After 3 more long and bitterly contested campaigns were fought there, Imperial domination finally occurred in 773.M41. Operation Newfound continued to experience significant impediments. Pockmarks of resistance continued to hamper the Crusade's efforts. To compound matters further, in 760.M41, a fierce and bloody counterstrike ripped into the Imperials mid-line. Led by Archon Nadzabar himself, the world of Sverin fell back into the forces of the arch-enemy. For only the second time in 5 standard years, the world found itself the site of a major warfare. General Bulletin soon found himself in command of the Imperial forces on Sverin, as he had experienced fighting in the land war on the contested planet 2 standard years earlier. His fierce determination was instrumental in preserving the declining morale of Imperial forces, as he refused to let the cursed world bedevil him twice. When relief convoys arrived in 761.M41, they soon determined that the beleaguered general had been fighting a war on 2 fronts, resisting both Magister Sholin Skara and the hosts of Archon Nedzabar himself. The arch-enemy forces were eventually driven to the tropical jungles of the southern continent. The forces of the arch-enemy were finally broken after 16 intense months of fighting. They soon fell into disarray as the momentum of their counterstrike was spent. The Archon and Magister Skara began a lengthy retreat to their final destiny on Balhaut. Yet the Warmaster grew impatient, as the second phase of the crusade was taking longer to accomplish than he had foreseen. Balhaut had been Slaydo's prized objective since the Crusade's inception. He knew the liberation of this world would prove to be both tactical and psychologically important. despite the constant persuasion of Lords Militant Sibon and Dravir to alter their plans in regard of Balhaut. Slaydo refused to consider any alternative plans proposed by them. He would not compromise his original tactical plans to take Balhaut, as he knew it would be a key world, and to oust the Archon and his forces from the planet would deliver a serious blow to the archenemy forces. By ignoring Balhaut and turning rimward to annex the sparsely defended Nebula Reach and Belt of Aristus, Slaydo believed their Crusade force would be left dangerously exposed along the coreward flank. In many regards, Slaydo's conduct in the Sabbat World's Crusade emulated the figure of Saint Sabbat Beates' original campaign in the sector. All the while, still in retreat from Sverin, Archon Nedzabar began to call upon his magisters and warlords to help formulate a large unified host against the Imperial Crusade. The Archon intended to draw the Imperial forces towards the world of Fabia, where he hoped to annihilate the Crusade in one fell swoop. Being a master of subterfuge, Slaydo recognized the Archon's attempt to draw his forces to Fabia, and ordered a series of false fleet dispositions and troop movements along various trade routes in order to suggest that he had fallen for the Archon's ruse and had taken the bait. Suspecting the Arch-enemy's spies existed within the ranks of the Crusade, he also began to disseminate disinformation, intelligence traffic, and Minotaurian orders, adding credibility to his deception. Gathering his forces for an assault on Fabia, the Archon maneuvered his forces into a gross mistake. In 765.M41, the arch-enemy forces were brought to Balhaut to be rearmed and resupplied. They were caught totally by surprise as the Imperial Crusade assaulted the planet. The assault on Balhaut would, in the future, remain a shining example of a planned military action that went according to plan and brought about the desired victory. Slaydo constructed his assault plan, codenamed Hellstorm, around the following key principles. Firstly, to achieve orbital superiority by fleet assault and to cause as much gross damage to enemy shipping as possible. Secondly, use sustained orbital bombardment of key surface regions. Thirdly, use a rapid and covered landing of primary planetary assault forces. And fourthly, use a rapid and covered landing of secondary planetary assault phases in reinforcement, contingent on the outcome of earlier phases. And thus Slaydo organized the fleet assault into 4 waves. The first spearhead wave was comprised of a rapid attack warship under Admiral Christor. They arrived in system 16 solar hours before the initial start of hostilities, translating into real space on the far side of the local star. His warships then utilized the radiated mass of the star to conceal his fleet's formations from the arch-enemy planetary detector grids. The second wave was composed of troop ships, mass conveyance vessels, and heavy orbital assaulters under the command of Vice Admiral Garnhorst. They arrived in system 5 solar hours later, holding position within the sugar and hydrocarbon clouds beyond the system edge. These 2 waves endeavored to get on station in readiness without detection. The warp ripples caused by the gathering arch-enemy fleet in system also served to make their own translation and mass displacement patterns. The third wave was the primary assault warships under the command of Admiral Shaver. They translated directly into the inner system zone at the beginning of the attack, leading the assault on the high and low anchor stations and orbital batteries. After Shaver's signal of engagement, Admiral Christor's forces struck hard and fast against the great orbital dock facilities on Balhaut High Station and Helidon Threshold. Garnhorst's third wave then began its move in system, coming in from behind the massing warships, preparing for a surface assault. Commanded by Vice Admiral Senluk, the fourth wave then arrived out-system, carrying the massive reinforcement divisions. By the end of Hour 21, after the initial hostilities, orbital superiority had been achieved. Planetary bombardment then commenced against the key surface targets. By Hour 33, the planetary drop began in earnest, with Austria Militarum forces delivered to the surface, while an attrition rate of only 32% lost during the landings, though north of the oligarchy, the percentage ran as high as 58%. By Hour 44, intense ground fighting ignited in the vast hive cities of Balhaut. Balopolis was one such city that saw extraordinary levels of fighting, which resulted in numerous casualties amongst the senior ranks of the Guard's officers. General Corell initially commanded the forces of Balopolis, finding himself in a brutal confrontation with the Kith, commanded by Magister Sholin Skara. Corel was severely injured soon after hour 48, forcing him to withdraw, and his replacement, General Corson, was killed around hour 53 of the assault, and his replacement, Marshal Burns, was killed around hour 58. With General Delany unable to get through to take command, Corel's command fell, by default, to the senior surviving officer amongst the staff, Commander Makaroth. When word reached Warmaster Slaydo of the dire circumstances that had befallen Corel's forces at Balhaut, he sent immediate dispatch promoting Makaroth to the rank of Marshal. The Warmaster elected to command the assault on the oligarchy himself. His landing force, the second largest single Imperial army fielded, after Lord Militant Cybons, was cutting a bloody path into the heart of the enemy. Slaydo faced intense opposition from the host of 4 magisters, including the infamous Heritor Asphodel and the murderous Chaos Cult army of the Archon himself. The Warmaster's final assault on the oligarchy raged for 10 consecutive solar days. The substantial orbital bombardment had reduced the terrain into so much rubble, and a series of severe storms turned the entire area into an expanse of mud lakes. Several thousand Imperial guardsmen perished in these deplorable conditions, sucked down into the slurry of mud, or slaughtered by the Archon's forces when they became mired. On day 5, the first breakthrough from the Imperial forces came in the form of Astartes from the White Scars chapter. They broke through the defense line at the Hollow Wall and routed the forces of Magister Kul Kolesh. The Magister was slain during the subsequent gun battle. On the 7th day, squads of Astartes from the Silver Guard under Chapter Master Vigum broke through the outer line of the Emancipatory, where they faced stiff opposition from Chaos Dreadnoughts and Magister Asphodel's Woe Machines. This deadlock was eventually broken by a massed Imperial armor support involving multiple armored brigades. Chapter Master Vigum then led the Silver Guard through, taking the Emancipatory in 2 solar hours, and stormed the monastery of St. Chiodrus with the aid of 3 Austromilitarum regiments. The Jantine Patricians and elements of the Mordian Iron Guard 11th Regiment took the precinct of the oligarchy. On day 9, Slaydo drove his left flank into the resolute oligarchy gate, which was commanded by Captain Alentis of the Silver Guard, but was devastated by the murderous Woe engines. The Harkin 8th Regiment was the first to reach the oligarchy gate and breach the enemy buttress fields and blow the gateway wide open. This breakthrough was swiftly supported by the Astartes of the Silver Guard, another Austromilitarum regiment, and 4 armored divisions. Following an intense assault by the Harkin forces, the Tower of the Plutarch fell later that day. Slaydo himself finally entered the inner precincts, at the head of the 8th Regiment, and his personal bodyguard force prepared to face Archon Nedzibar. As Warmaster Slaydo pressed his final advance on the palace of the oligarchy, he received word of Marshal Makaroth's success at Balhaut. The young officer had turned Balhaut from rout to unexpected Imperial victory. The Warmaster was reported as being struck mute with great admiration. The price for taking the cursed planet had become all too evident to the embittered Warmaster. The height of the crusade weighed heavily upon Slaydo. Some forces reported later that he seemed to be weary and fatalistic. Taking up his power sword, the Warmaster personally led the first attack wave against the palace of the oligarchy. The firefights that took place within the confines of the palace were brutal to the extreme. Yet, at the 18th of the 10th solar day, Slaydo's command force encountered the Archon Nedzibar and his elite bodyguard on the western palisade. The Warmaster and the vile Archon soon joined in furious intense single combat. Depending on sources, the fight was brutal, each combatant exchanging heavy blows. Somewhere in the intense struggle, Slaydo was struck by 2 mortal wounds that he somehow managed to push past, maintaining the initiative before delivering the lethal blow to the Archon. The Archon fell back, dying as his cultist followers stormed the palisade to retrieve their fallen leader and carry him away to safety. Austromilitarum units valiantly defended their fallen Warmaster, putting many cultists to their death. Slaydo was found, close to death, lying on the marble floor of the West Atrium. He was far beyond any medical help, as his grievous wounds appeared to be fatal. The Warmaster's own bodyguard stormed the palisade and slaughtered any arch-enemy forces they came across. Archon Nedzibar's corpse was later discovered amongst a heap of massacred bodies near a fallen palanquin. Slaydo's men had indiscriminately cut down the fleeing cultists, and only afterwards established the identity of their burden. As for the forces of the arch-enemy, Fortunately, most of the Archon's brutal magisters perished during the fighting on Balhaut, though there were some lamentable exceptions. Most notably, Magisters Sholin Skara and Heritor Asphodel lived to pose future threats to the Crusade force. Skara and a large contingent of his Kith followers managed to successfully escape the purging fires of Balhaut. Skara's fate was unknown several standard years after Nadzabar's death at the hands of Warmaster Slaydo. For his part, the Heritor managed to evade Imperial ground forces and succeeded in escaping his fate. His ultimate fate would be unknown for a few Terran years until he later revealed himself on the hive world of Vargost. Apart from the forces that had fled Balhaut, many more arch-enemy forces had been en route to reinforce the beleaguered forces of the Archon diverted or withdrew when word reached them of the disastrous defeat. The inner quadrants of the Newfound trailing region suffered terribly, as many worlds in the region were either sacked or outright destroyed. Almost as many worlds were caught up in the aftermath of the enemy retreat, including Sapientia, Vargost, Iaxe Cardinal, Lamesia, Erismias, Unida, and Cocominus. Eventually, many of these planets were reconquered and saved from the unendurable suffering and hardship, though not before many Imperial lives had been either corrupted or lost. And as for Slaydo? Well, the Warmaster managed to live long enough to see the victory of Balhaut completed, although the pacification efforts would continue for a considerable amount of time. His premonition about himself not living to see the successful completion of the crusade had proved accurate, though many witnesses reported that he had died contently, resigned to his inevitable fate to die in Balhaut, as if fully expecting it. It should be noted that Slaydo's primary anxiety lay not in his foretold fate, but in that of his eventual successor. The Warmaster recognized that there would more than likely be infighting amongst the Lords Militant. He knew the crusade could not afford to be riven with internal dispute, and that it would take a strong leader to capitalize on a great victory. Slaydo's body was laid to rest with full honors on Balhaut, housed in a large mausoleum known as the Honorarium. The dying Slaydo appointed the young Marshal Makaroth to be his successor as Warmaster. This appointment by the dying Warmaster brokered no arguments from the Lords Militant, but Cybon, Hector Draver, and others were incensed at Slaydo's decision, regarding the newly appointed Warmaster as too young and too junior. A period of bitter political infighting ensued, but Makaroth managed to cling to his rightful position as the newly appointed senior commander of the crusade. By refusing to be cowed by the more senior officers, Makaroth displayed early on that he displayed the talent to outplay his rivals politically, and that he had the ideal temperament for the role. In the solar decades since the Balhaut campaign, Warmaster Makaroth came to be regarded as one of the foremost military commanders of his time, standing upon the shoulders of his noble predecessor, and using the solid gains of the early days of the Crusade as a springboard towards further Imperial victories. Perhaps this is what Slaydo had recognized in the young commander when deciding on a suitable successor. Makaroth would continue to display from the very beginning of his war mastery, his brilliant military tactics, initiative intellect, instincts, and willingness to take risks, especially with his extraordinary prosecution of the Cabal Salent campaign. Yet, this is where I leave you. Tune in next week as we start with who this Makaroth is, and why he was so important that he took over for Slaydo. I hope you enjoyed this, Fox. And if you did, please like, comment, follow, and subscribe. And perhaps join our support on my YouTube channel, Tales of Ashraka. Have a great day. And as always,
until next time, this is Zeckthar, signing off.